Thanks so much, Barbara. Can everyone let me know if you can hear me? Let me know in the chat if that audio is coming through okay for you. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you. I'm just curious before we get started, where's everybody coming from today? Can you let us know in the chat your institution, your state, if anyone's having beautiful weather so that we can all be jealous? All right, New York, Michigan, Connecticut, Pennsylvania. Wow, awesome. Florida, I bet Florida's got some really nice weather today. All right, we're very rainy here in the Pacific Northwest. All right, so thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to come and join us to hear about the Report Reader Checklist. This is a new research resource that we have developed through the Ecampus Research Unit. And I do want to let you know before we get started that you can actually download the checklist as a PDF document. You can print it if you want to be referencing it during today's session. Just go to ecampus.oregonstate.edu/checklist. And we can throw that link into the chat. That is ecampus.oregonstate.edu/checklist. And if you want to go there now, you can download the checklist and be taking a look at it. We are going to do a walkthrough of it today. We're also going to be showing you the website where it is today as well, so you can get a little bit of a walkthrough there. All right, so just to give you a little bit of context about the Ecampus Research Unit that I direct here at Oregon State University, we are really focused on research literacy for the field of online teaching and learning. This is something that's been really important to us. This is in part because of things like conference presentations where we speak to audiences that have a really wide range of academic research training. We also have a lot of questions raised within our own organization from our instructional designers, our multimedia specialists, our student support advisors who want to know more about research about online teaching and learning. And we know that even people who have kind of formal academic research training don't necessarily have training in all the methodologies and all the designs. And so we're very interested in kind of helping people to learn more about that. Seeing a question about the link for the checklist, so let me just put it really quick into the chat. There you go. All right, so in the research unit, we have created a range of tools and resources, and the checklist is just one of them. We also have the Online Learning Efficacy Research Database, which is a free database of studies that compare online, blended, and face-to-face modalities so that you can see what works in online education. We also have the Research in Action podcast, which is a weekly show that talks with researchers from all over the world about topics and issues related to research in higher education. Our recent edited collection on high impact practices in online education is another way that we're providing information back to the field. And then we have a range of national and local studies on our website. If you want to check that out, you can find that where the checklist is located. You'll also see information about our studies as well. So in today's webinar, what we're going to be focusing on, this is just really quickly who's presenting to you today. So myself. You can find my email here. If you are tweeting, live tweeting the session, please feel free to use my personal Twitter handle, which is @Katie_Linder, or you can use our research unit handle, which is @EC Research Unit. And then in the middle of today's webinar, we're going to be joined by Mary Ellen Delastrito, who's our Assistant Director of Research. We love to hear from folks, so please feel free to email us with any questions. So in today's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about the purpose of the Report Reader Checklist, how it came to be. We're going to look at the checklist itself and kind of give you a walkthrough of the different criteria that are included there. We're going to tour the checklist supplemental website and also field any questions you have about the checklist categories. And we'd love to hear from you about how you think this resource might be used in your day-to-day work once you've had a chance to explore it and see if you think it might be useful for you. All right, so for the past several years, the Ecampus Research Unit has met together with a small group of people, and we've been reading reports and articles and things in the field to improve our own research awareness and research literacy. And during these sessions, as we were reading different reports in the field, sometimes we would have questions about the research design or the research methodology that we felt like the report itself couldn't really answer. There wasn't maybe enough information that was included there that would help us. So for example, there might be a pie chart that had a percentage represented, but we didn't know what the overall N was. We didn't know what 5% actually meant in that pie chart because there wasn't an accompanying N to tell us that. And what we found that's kind of interesting about distance education as a field is that we rely heavily on these reports, sometimes even more than peer-reviewed articles, because peer review takes quite a long time. We're a very quick-moving field, and we need to be looking at studies and reports and findings on a much quicker basis so that we can be making decisions. And so what we decided to do was to create a checklist that readers could use, and even report writers could use if they wanted to be able to quickly go through a report and see, are all the kind of fundamental things that you might need to digest that report, to see if it was a report of good quality, if it was rigorous, if it had all of the elements of the research design that you would need to kind of make some of those decisions. Now, this is also meant to help you process the report and to kind of look through it in a way that's going to allow you to ask the right questions, and maybe even to use the data from the report or the findings from the report to make decisions in your own professional life and work. So a huge part of our mission, as I said, is increasing research literacy in the field. And that's really what planted the seed for this in the beginning. So let me tell you a little bit about the report itself and what we're going to walk you through in terms of its categories. So the report reader checklist is free. That's maybe one of the most important things to know about it. It is a free downloadable resource on our website, and it's really meant to help you look for those basic elements in a report. And this is, I think, for people who may be new to reading reports in our field, but also for people who are just trying to read more efficiently and trying to look directly for the kinds of things that are going to tell them if they should take action based on what the report is saying. So we designed this tool specifically with study reports from our field in mind, but we do think it could have broader applications. People have asked us already, could this be used to look at peer-reviewed articles? Could this be used to look at things like dissertations? It's possible that it could be, but it was really designed when we were thinking about the reports that were coming out in our field specifically. Now, our hope is that the tool will help you to find certain elements in a report. And the general idea is that it's not a scorecard. It's not about kind of assigning a grade to our reports in our field. But if you were to look at one of these 6 areas that we're going to talk about in more detail in just a little bit, and you didn't really see any of the elements of that area included in the report, it might make you question a little bit what's going on there. Like, why did they choose not to include that information? Or might even make you ask a question of the report author if they were presenting at a conference, or if you wanted to email them and say, could you give me a little more information about this particular area, so that you kind of understand in a more contextualized way what the report is supposed to represent. Now, we developed 6 areas of the checklist, and we developed them through a couple different methods. One was through noting the common missing elements that we often would see in reports in our field. There were certain things that we saw kind of over and over again that were not included. We also developed these 6 categories because we have a couple people on our team who teach research methods. So they know kind of the basics of research design and methodology, and the kinds of things that we had questions about as we were reading these reports are often very basic kind of research design and methods elements. And so we also looked to things like research design and methods textbooks to help us decide what are the things that we really felt were core when it came to evaluating the quality and the rigor of these reports. So the 6 areas that we landed on are: number 1, context; 2 is methodology; 3 is sample; 4 is reporting results; 5 is transparency; and 6 is reader experience. And in a general way, we also set these up so that as you were reading a report, you would kind of get into these categories perhaps chronologically. As you start the report, you might hear context in the introduction. Sometimes the methodology is included next, although sometimes it's in an appendix. Then you might hear information about the sample being used in the report. So our idea was that as you go through it, you might see these things in roughly this order. Now, the checklist was pilot tested with a range of researchers who were at different literacy levels. So some people who had more formal training, other people who didn't have more formal training, and then we revised it into the version that we're currently presenting to you today. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the presentation over to my colleague, Mary Ellen, who's going to walk through each of these 6 areas. And then we're going to show you the supplemental website that we created as an additional resource for this tool. As we walk through the 6 areas, I want to remind you that we do have that Q&A feature on the webinar. So if you have specific questions about a particular area of the checklist, feel free to drop it in that Q&A section, and then we will make sure to come back to that at the end of the webinar.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Mary Ellen Delastrito. As Katie said, I'm the Assistant Director of the unit, and I'm going to go through each of our 6 areas that she has shown you and talk a little bit about the things that you should be considering in each of these areas. So the first area that I'm going to talk about is context. So the first area is on the screen right now, and context is really important. It's very important that we understand the context of a study that you're reading about or a report that you're reading about, because it really helps us to understand why does this matter, right? A context piece will help us really take the work and understand where it fits within a larger discipline, for example. So it's important to know the context. And on this slide, what you're going to see here is 4 ways to look for context in a research report or a study report. So the first one here is that the report describes the larger purpose or need for the study. So why is this study important? What happened in a particular environment that spurred an interest in asking a particular question? So if you have a study that meets some sort of need, right, that you needed information about your students, for example, that needs to be a part of the context. The context is usually included at the beginning of the report and in some cases at the end of the report. So you may see some of this in several different locations. Another way to look for context is to look to see if the report explains the history of the study and or theoretical frameworks if they're appropriate. So particularly in distance ed, we see there are studies that are repeated over a series of years. And so it's important to know when you pick up a report, is this the first time they have done this study, or is this a study that was repeated every other year? And explaining that context is really important so that you can know what's the background of what has happened in this particular area. So if it's an enrollment study, for example, this is the second time that we have looked at these particular research questions. The third area to consider under context is the research aims or goals. It's very important, especially early in a report, that you understand as the reader what was the purpose of the study, what were the goals of the study, what is this study supposed to provide to the reader to understand a particular question. And so that should be early in a particular report. And then the last area to consider is that the report offers suggestions for further research. That's also an interesting piece of context that you might find later in a report. Understanding the findings in context of what the next step is, or understanding the findings in the context of a broader area of research. So one thing to consider is if one or more of these things are missing, or things that are applicable to a particular report, that's a concern, because the reader may not be able to understand how that study relates to or informs the general understanding of whatever the topic of the report is. So context, I think, is extremely important, and without it, the value of the report or the value of the study is lessened. So that's an important piece. Now, as I mentioned, we have these kind of 4 areas to look for context. Later on in the presentation, Katie's going to show you where we have provided some examples of studies that have done this and that have shown these larger purposes, the context, the aims and the goals, and suggestions. So if you're not quite understanding how this would look in a report, we have opportunities for you to go and look at sample reports that have done this. So that's our first area to consider, context. The second area that we're going to consider here is methodology. So let me go to our second area of methodology. Now, a methodology section should describe how the study was conducted, and ideally in a methodology study, we should be able to see what happened and how it was conducted from beginning to end. So that's something that you can look at. You also want to consider, is the methodology section descriptive enough so that you could roughly repeat the study or replicate or conduct the study again. So keep that in mind when we look at the 5 points here under methodology. So first point, as I've already mentioned, is does it have a methodology section? That's really important, again, for us to understand. Is the methodology section there? And the location of a methodology section might vary from report to report. In some cases, you might see a methodology section early in a report, but more often with reports in online ed, you may see them toward the end or in an appendix, and not maybe at the beginning of a report. So the second bullet here is, in the methodology section, is it clear how data were collected? This is a really key piece. It's important for the reader to know, was the data collected through surveys? Was the data collected through interviews? Was it an online survey? Or was it data collected from surveys that were collected in the past? Is it archival data? Where did the data come from? And again, that's a really important piece for us to know in terms of understanding the value of these reports. And this will help us to better assess, is this a valid study? Where did the data come from? Following that, it's also important to know, as a reader, how were the data used in this study? And so that's the third point here. Is it clear how data were analyzed? One way to think about this is to consider, is this qualitative or is it quantitative data? So if it was quantitative data, did they provide frequencies in the report? Did they provide averages or means in the report? Or if it was qualitative data, did they do thematic analysis and coding? So understanding how the data were analyzed, again, will help us understand the validity and the appropriateness of the study. Letter D is about statistical analysis. So if statistical analysis were done on, let's say, quantitative data in a particular study, it's important to know what that statistical analysis was. And it's important that we know what are the specific tests that were run. And so if they're doing basic testing of differences between groups, what kind of statistical tests were used? And it's, again, important for us to know that as a reader so that we can assess the validity. Was this an appropriate test for the data that they were using? And so that's kind of a quantitative example. And then in letter E, if it's a qualitative study or a study that included qualitative data, it's important to know if coding was done. Was coding done to gather information from that qualitative or, let's say, interview information? And it's important for the reader to know what procedure did they use in coding data. So for example, did they start out with a set of themes and code the data based on predetermined themes? Or did they arrive at themes from the data? And again, those are two different procedures. It would be important for us as readers to know that. So what happens if this information is missing? So if some or any of these pieces are missing, you're really going to have a difficult time understanding specifically what the study investigated. And specifically, you're going to have a difficulty evaluating how and where these study results can be applied. So this is a very important kind of component of these research reports. So now I'm going to talk about an area that is related to the methodology, which is the sample. So these two sections are very much related, and often you will see information about a sample in a methodology section. So I thought I would mention that kind of relationship here. So information on study participants, so who were the participants in a study, is usually included in that methodology section. And it's really important that we understand, again, as we mentioned, that data source. Is this existing data, or are these participants that were recruited for a study? And it's very important that these participants are described in detail. So who are they? How many were engaged in the study? What is the sample size? What was the rate of response, let's say, if it was an online survey? Understanding those study participants is really critical, again, for understanding the applicability of the study. In letter B, we talk about the participant recruitment question. So how were the participants recruited for the study? So what population was recruited? So if we were looking at a study of undergraduate students, did we recruit appropriately in that sample? If we were looking particularly for first-year students, how did we recruit those students? So that's a key piece here to understanding our sample. In letter C, we talk about the participant sample representing an appropriate level of diversity for the study. This is important for us to know, again, as readers. Is this an appropriate sample? So for example, as I mentioned, if we had a study that looked at undergraduate students and we ended up with a sample that had all seniors in it, is that an appropriate level of diversity? Do we want to see a different levels of class standing in our sample? It's important for the reader to understand that piece. And then finally, in letter D, we talk about subgroups. This is very important, again, in the sample to understand if analysis was done on particular groups within a study. Are they appropriately defined and are they labeled? So when you're looking at tables or charts in a particular report, is it clear that they're talking about the entire sample, or are they looking at a particular subgroup, such as seniors? That's important that the reader be able to distinguish what data is being represented. So as I've mentioned through all four of these points, if you don't have this information, if some of this information is missing, you may or may not be able to understand where the results are coming from or to whom the results are going to apply. And without this information, again, it's difficult to evaluate whether the study's results are relevant to other populations. If you don't know what the study or who the study is based on, it's very difficult to extend beyond the study. And this is often a term that you may have heard of called generalizability. So knowing this information about the sample in a particular study will help you make decisions about, does this study generalize to, let's say, students at my university? And so this is a critical piece to consider. So I'm going to move now to the fourth area. And our fourth area is on reporting results. And results, of course, are really important. This is why you have gone to read this study. And some of you may jump right to the results, right? So this may be the important pieces that you are looking for. And so we've got 5 things to consider when you are looking at a report and the results section of a report. So number 1, or letter A here that we show on the screen, is really probably the most important point here. Are all numbers that are used in the report easy to comprehend? That may sound simple, but it's very, very important that the reader be able to understand where numbers came from, how numbers were calculated, to understand what numbers are being represented, let's say in a chart or a graph. So that's really, really important. Part of that process is shown in letter B, which is the N. So the N here is a big capital N, usually refers to the sample, right? So how many people were interviewed? How many people were a part of an online survey? It's very important for us to understand what is the population under study, how many responded, and what data is being shown in terms of the respondents. And those N's should be described in text, in graphs, in tables, and charts, so that we can assess how many people are we talking about here. And in some cases, what you might note is that we use the smaller or the lowercase n to refer to subgroups. So in a group of 1,000 students, we might find a smaller subgroup of graduate students, and that might be the smaller n. But it's important for us to know and be able to identify those groups in these studies. So point C is about missing data, is very much related to point B, right? So if you have a survey in which you have 1,000 students who responded, did all 1,000 of those students respond to every question? Maybe not. And so it's important for the reader to know that here's an item in which only 75% of the sample responded. So that's what we need here in terms of missing data. So a good results section will include identifying that missing data. The fourth point here is understanding or clarity about where the study findings fit in with the study's purpose, the research questions, and the methodology. A good results section will present the results in this context of the purpose, the research questions, and the methodology. And again, as I mentioned, this is why you've gone to this study, because you want to see what the results are. So it's important that the study is presented in a way that it's answering those questions. And then finally, the last point here is about data visualizations. And we're talking here about charts, graphs, and tables. And those things should help you to understand the results and to understand the relationships between the data that was collected in a particular study. So it's very important that you kind of assess those and see if they are helpful to you. For example, have you ever seen a pie chart that doesn't add up to 100%? Right? We've seen them. So this is an example of a data visualization that may not be helpful in enhancing your understanding of the results. So that gives you, again, a better sense of what's happening with the data in this particular study that you're talking about. So moving on now to 5, our 5th area is transparency. So transparency, as we've described it here, we've described it as an ethical research practice. So it's ethical to be transparent. And it's ethical to try to provide as much detail about a study. And as I mentioned before, this is important for future research. It's important for replication. If someone wants to carry on a line of research, it's important to be transparent about how the research was done so it can be repeated, or so others can do data analysis on the data that is included in a particular study. So reports that are fully transparent specifically are going to include data tables, research instruments, surveys, interview protocols where possible. And so that's what you see here in our 4 points. So in A, we talk about raw quantitative data, tables of frequency counts for the entire study should be included somewhere in the report. And in some cases, you might find these things in an appendix. And that's for your reference. So you can really get a sense of who has responded to what item and how have they responded. And that's one way to be very transparent. As I already mentioned in B, the instrument or the study protocol should be provided in a report or as an appendix in order for other researchers to potentially replicate your study. This is another way to be very transparent. Now, letter C is a little bit different here, and letter C is about a different level of transparency. In this case, we are recommending that authors need to be clear about any conflicts of interest or other motivations for their role in the study. And this is important for studies, particularly that you might see have participation from vendors, from companies, or maybe market researchers. We have an example on our website of a study that actually calls out that potential conflict of interest. And so that's a piece related also to transparency. And then finally, any commentary or discussion that's rooted in data or the results or study findings should be related specifically and rooted to that study within the report. So authors should not be making claims that are beyond the scope of the data that's presented. So look at those commentary sections or those conclusions and discussion sections in reports and make sure that those discussions are very much tied to the results that they have presented. And that's another way in which you can identify the transparency in these cases. Again, if any of these things are missing, particularly A and B that I talked about, if any of these are missing, it's very difficult for the reader to really evaluate the study. And the ability to evaluate the study is diminished when you don't have this level of transparency that we're talking about here. And now I'm going to go to the last area, which is the reader experience. Last but not least, as you might imagine, the reader experience is still really important. So these are our 4 things to consider in terms of the reader experience in a study or report. Does the report use language that's easy to understand? What do we mean by that? No jargon, making sure that terms are defined, and spelling out acronyms, right? These are things that help the reader to really understand what the study is about. Does the report meet ADA accessibility standards? That's also a concern. So is a particular report readily usable with a screen reader? Is one example here of a report meeting accessibility standards. Does the report include an executive summary or an abstract for ease of digesting study findings? We all love a really good executive summary, right? Because it gives us the bullet points or the short story of what we want to take away from a study. So those are our key components in this case. And then finally, the report, is it an appropriate length for the study scope and the reporting of the results? If a study is too long, we might have considered that it needed to be separate reports, for example. Or if a study doesn't have enough detail and is too short, that's also an important consideration in terms of this reader experience. So reader experience includes accessibility, as we mentioned here, and particularly if any of these pieces of the reader experience are missing, they may have difficulty applying the results that we have from these study reports and using them in their work. So this is the last kind of area that we considered. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Katie, and she's going to take a walkthrough of our website to show you some of the pieces that we mentioned.
All right, thank you, Mary Ellen. So one of the things we thought of when we were creating this tool was it may not be enough for people to just read the item on the checklist. They might actually need more information or more examples of where they can find different things that are related to the things we're talking about on the checklist. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of the slide deck here and take you to the website where you can take a look at the checklist and the supplementary materials. So on my screen now, you should be able to see the checklist website. Can somebody confirm in the chat that you do indeed see the checklist website on my screen? Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, so on this website, when you come to the Ecampus Research Unit site in general, you'll see that we have a tools menu item, and you can find the report reader checklist right under that tools section. That's also where we have our database as well. And what you'll see when you come to the website is you will automatically be able to go in and look at the supplementary materials. I'm going to take you there in just a second. You're also going to be able to read a frequently asked questions page. If you want to know more about how we develop the checklist, how we recommend utilizing it, anything along those lines, you're going to find that in frequently asked questions. So we can look at that in a second as well. And then you can also directly download the checklist from this front page. So if you want to have a copy or you want to share a copy with someone, it is a PDF document that you can download and share as you would like. We've also included some information here about how to email us if you have feedback about the checklist. We welcome feedback about all of the tools that we create here in the research unit. We want to know how you're using it, if it's helpful, if there are aspects of it that you could use more explanation with. We want to know all of that information. We've also included some buttons if you want to share the report reader checklist with colleagues. If you want to share it out on social media or via email, you can easily do that here as well. And then if you're just curious about the other things that we're working on here in the research unit, you can check out our current projects. What I want to do though is tell you about the supplemental part of the website that takes you into each of the different categories that we talked about in today's webinar, where you can find out more information. So let's just click on context to look at it as an example. So one of the first things to note when you come into one of these 6 areas is that you can access the other 6 areas here on the right side of the screen. And you can also download the one-page version of the checklist in any part of the website. Now, you'll also see that for each of the areas that Mary Ellen talked about in this particular context section of the checklist, we've given you additional information about why we think that area is important to include and where you might find it, and just some additional information that could be useful for you. We've also done this for each of the general areas that we chose in the 6 parts of the checklist, if you want to learn more about that and why we chose, for example, context. Now, you'll also note that there are some areas of the website that have highlighted words. And this basically means we thought this could be an area or a phrase or a word that could be confusing or that people just wouldn't know what it meant. And so we added an additional definition to give you more information about that particular concept. So when you see a highlighted word, you can click on it and see additional information about what it means. Now you can also see examples for each of the different criteria that we've included on the checklist. And I do feel like I have to say, it's really hard to find a report that does all of this stuff well. We've included a lot of information on this checklist. And so we've broken down these examples specifically to individual criteria. So you could look and see an example. For A, this is down at the bottom of the page, the report describes the larger purpose or need for the study. We've given an example of a report, we've linked to where you can find that report, and then we've given you specific pages that we recommend that you look at to find that particular criterion that we included on the checklist. And every single one that Mary Ellen talked about has at least one example, if not more. So you can always find a link to those reports and specific pages that we think might be useful for you to take a look at. Now, if you want to, you can click Return to Section, and it's just going to take you right up to the top of the page where you were again. This is just kind of a way to help you navigate the pages if you would like. Now, if you go into another section, you're going to see a very similar structure. There's some information about it in a general way. There is information about each of the criterion that we've included. You'll see the highlighted words that you can click on and learn more about. And you'll also see links to examples down at the bottom of the page that you can look to if you want to see what this looks like in context of an actual report. So I want to take us back to the main page of the checklist so I can also show you a couple other pieces. The FAQ page, or the frequently asked questions page, is where we've included some information about the process for creating the checklist, how we chose the examples that are included in the checklist, how we recommend that people use the report reader checklist. So this is also kind of some additional context and information if you want to check that out as well. But perhaps the most important part of the website is the Download Now button. When you download the checklist, you will get a copy that looks like this. And it is a PDF, as I mentioned. And if you want, you can actually check things off. You can download it as many times as you might need to. This is also a document where we've tried to include some white space. So if you want to take notes on the checklist itself as you're working through a report, this would work as a great cover sheet to print out a report, append this to it if you had to come back to it later, and you could see how it did according to our report reader checklist. All right, so I'm going to take us back to the slide deck here. And we just have a slide here about where exactly you can go and download the checklist if you want to do that. But I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and feedback. So let me go ahead and turn things over to Barbara to see if we have any questions. You can make sure and use that Q&A feature if you want to drop a question in there. We would love to hear what questions you have about the checklist or how you think you might use it in your day-to-day work.
All right, thanks so much, Katie and Mary Ellen. We do have a couple of questions to start, and I see some more coming in, so I'll try to take them in order. The first question is from relatively early in your presentation, asking, are there recruitment methods that are more valid, or does it depend on the study and its goals?
So it definitely depends on the study and its goals. This is a great question. One thing that sometimes you'll see a little bit of caution around is if you see that someone has a population or a sample of convenience. And this is something that if you're designing a study and you take it to the IRB for approval, they might question this as well. A population of convenience is basically one that you choose because they were easy for you to get to. And so you're not necessarily getting something that feels representative, but you're kind of going with a population that is just, it's convenient. That's why it's called a population of convenience. So recently we were looking at a study and we saw that an instrument in the study had been tested on a certain population, and that population was a group of graduate students in a higher education course in a college of education. And that was not who the instrument was originally intended for. It was not intended for people who had graduate level experience. It was also not intended for people who had high levels of experience with pedagogy. And so that would be something that we might question in that study to say, well, you tested it with a group of people, but they weren't ultimately the people who were going to be using this. And so, because that was a population of convenience, it might raise some questions about whether or not that testing was done adequately. So those are the kinds of things that we would say to keep a lookout for, is if there's a population or a sample of convenience. But you should absolutely think about what is the research question, and just does it make sense? Does it make logical sense that they chose to recruit in the way that they did, and that they got the number of people that they did, and that they were able to make the kinds of claims that they're making in the study based on that particular sample?
All right, thank you. There's another question. Are reports and studies the same thing? Are there any assumptions a reader might consider about the source of a report and or a study?
This is a really good question. So this definitely, I would say that many reports are the results of a study. Like, that is what they're intended to share. And so if there is a report and it is about study results, you will often see some kind of methodology. Like, there has to be some kind of systematic investigation that occurred. And if they're sharing results, you should know kind of how they got to that. Oftentimes in our field, we see these reports being created by organizations, research groups, sometimes research consultancies, sometimes they're in partnership with vendors. And so there are a lot of different people who might contribute to a report that's done. One of our reports, for example, we did in collaboration with 3Play Media because it was about captioning. So we partnered with that vendor and they helped us to recruit for that report. They also helped us to disseminate what we learned. But in terms of writing up the results, doing the analysis, that was done by the Ecampus research unit. So even for us to share out kind of transparently the different roles that people had in that report, that it was partially funded by a vendor, what does that mean that it was partially funded? What exactly did they fund? All of those kinds of things are really important to share with these reports. So it's not that a study and a report would be different. It's often that the report would be used to share out the results of a study. But the kinds of studies we're talking about here would be different probably from like a peer-reviewed article. Those standards are often different in terms of what we're expected to see in terms of even level of detail. But the basic things that we're talking about in the checklist should all be present whenever you're reporting those kinds of results from a study. And I would say especially so if you're expecting people to make decisions or to change practice based on the kinds of things that you're reporting out. It's a great question.
All right, here's a question. You might want to pull up the website again. Somebody is asking if you can review where the FAQs are.
Yes, there is a link. I can pull up the website. When you come to the front page of where the checklist is, if you scroll down, there is an about the checklist kind of area right here, and it says read the FAQ, and you can click right there to get to the frequently asked questions. So it's right from the front page of where you would go to do the checklist. And it looks like that link, Barbara dropped it right into the chat. So it's that ecampus.oregonstate.edu/checklist. That's the shorter link. You'll see up here, there's a little bit of a longer link in our menu here. But if you use the short list with the short link with the checklist, you'll get right here where the fact page is.
Thanks. Okay, another question here. Gemma says, I am a quantitative researcher who has been trained to develop reports into which all those components discussed today are incorporated. Unlike peer-reviewed journal articles, reports are often consumed by practitioners whose background is not the academy. With that said, my dilemma is that often this type of good quality research literacy could be read too researchy to a non-researcher audience, including practitioners and policymakers. Anything you would like to share with us in terms of this issue?
This is such a good question. Thank you so much for asking it. So what I would say to this is, especially if you're writing a report that is for a range of audiences, think about creative ways that you can include the information that people who are having a research background would want to know. So that could be that it's in an appendix, that the people who are kind of more practitioners or they don't care about some of this other stuff, but it's still there. It's still available for people who do have questions. And maybe it's on a supplemental website. You know, you include not necessarily in the report itself, but you say, we've created an additional website if you want to read more about the methodology. And you can also think about books, for example, that are kind of trade press books, but that are written by researchers, where they just have a lot of footnotes, or they include at the back of the book their methodology. I think about Brene Brown, for example, is a good example of this. She's a sociologist who writes trade books, but in the back of her books, you can always find information about how she came to the conclusions that she's writing about, but she's writing to very popular audiences. So we would say the same thing, is if you have that kind of wide range of readers, it's possible that you also have people who really do want that information. And so you just want to kind of think creatively about where you can put it so that it's in the appropriate place for the people who are going to ask those questions.
All right, we have a comment from Candy at North Idaho College saying this is a great encapsulation of the how-tos in reading studies and reports. It reinforced a lot of what I understand, but with good reminders of areas that I had not really thought through about in a while. This is great for my daughter who is in college going into grad school. Very nice presentation. If my daughter had a question or two about the how-tos, could she email you directly?
Absolutely, we welcome that. And thank you for your nice words about the tool.
And then we've got a question. Would you say a few words about the value or place of a review of the literature for a report and a peer-reviewed article?
Ooh, this is a really good question. So I would definitely place that within the context part of what we talked about today. In study reports, this is often something that is truncated might be kind of a good word to use. It's not common to have lengthy literature reviews in these study reports. And sometimes that's a good place to go to a supplemental website or to put it in an appendix or something, because in all likelihood, the authors of these studies have done a thorough literature review to design the study. But in terms of the report, they just haven't included a ton of context. I think that for these reports, it is not a common practice to do an in-depth literature review, but it is helpful to think carefully as a report writer about what does the reader need to know to have the appropriate context of what has gone on in this report or what it's responding to in terms of a problem, an issue, a question in the field. If there's a gap, how do we know that that gap exists? And really trying to, again, give that broader context. As Mary Ellen pointed out earlier, a lot of our reports in our field are repetitive. They have repeated methodologies that come out every year, and we look at things in relationship to earlier reports. And so even the lit review of that goes into a summary of, in the past several years, this is what this report has focused on or looked at. And I think, for example, a good example of this would be the Horizon report, which often shows you what are the areas of interest for several of the past years of reports so that you know kind of what the previous trends have been or what the previous things have been pointed out so that you can compare this year's potential trends with previous years. So I think the lit review, of course, is important. It is more common to see it in a peer-reviewed article or in a lengthier publication like a book than you would see it in our study reports in our field.
Well, that is all the questions that folks have typed in to the Q&A, and somebody did ask for the link again to the checklist, so I think that you can get to it right from there. What's being shown.
So I'm putting up the general website for our research unit if you want to take a look at that. Again, you can find the checklist under the tools menu item of our website if you check it out. I see someone else asked for our email address. Our general email address is ecresearchunit@oregonstate.edu. And I can also drop personal email addresses into our chat feature here in case that's useful to you as well. So I'll put mine in first. You can find me at katherinelinder.oregonstate.edu, and then Mary Ellen Dellostrito at oregonstate.edu. And if you have, I'm realizing I had a little typo there, so I'm going to do that one again for Mary Ellen. For Mary Ellen, she is our resident stats expert. So if you have questions that are more about the quantitative side of these studies, you might want to reach out to her. I am our resident qualitative expert. And so if you have more questions about the qualitative side, that's my background and training. So either one of us are happy to answer kind of more broad and general questions, but if you have specific things, let us know.
All right, it looks like we have another question that just popped in asking, how does someone find a report or study worthy to read?
Ooh, this is a good question. So what I would say is we have several recent links to reports on our website in that example section. We found that there are roughly between, well, maybe like a dozen reports that come out every year in our field. And we are going to be updating those examples with more recent reports as they come out and as we have a chance to review them and apply them to the checklist. But there are so many different places that you can look. Many of these reports are tied in some way to our national organizations. So I know that QM has a report that comes out consistently. Barbara may want to talk about that. OLC has a report. ELI is now, EDUCAUSE is now connected with the Horizon report. I think OLC houses the Babson reports. So there are many different places, but I would start with our national organizations with online teaching and learning. I see Barbara has posted a link to upcoming research and webinars and research from QM, which might be a great place to start to look for reports as well.
Thanks, Katie. If you want to advance to the next slide, I think that'll show a little bit more information from Quality Matters. All right, so I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. I think there was a wealth of wonderful information on the report reader checklist, and I was taking notes the whole time. I want to let everybody know that we do have a series of research webinars at Quality Matters, and you will be able to check those out at the link that's shown on this slide. In April, we are going to be doing an overview of the third QM EduVentures Changing Landscape of Online Education report, which is coming out in late March. So we the date and time of that webinar. Thank you all very much. The recording and slides sent out this time next week. We appreciate it. Thanks, Katie and Mary Ellen.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.